Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping softly into the darkest, quietest corners of human history. The places built not for living, but for forgetting. The places where freedom ended at a locked door, and where a single night could feel like an eternity. Tonight, we're visiting the world's most notorious prisons, not to frighten you, but to understand them, to listen to them, and to let their stories slow your heartbeat as you drift into sleep. From the cold waves surrounding Alcatraz to the stone towers of medieval London, from the suffocating jungles of Devil's Island to the silent, echoing corridors of Eastern State Penitentiary, each prison holds a whispered truth about justice, power, suffering, and the small, stubborn spark of hope that refuses to die. As we walk through these forgotten hallways together, let the soft sounds of distant footsteps, fading echoes, and gentle winds help your mind loosen its grip on the day. Let history feel less like a lesson and more like a lullaby, woven from centuries of human resilience. So, before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, settle your breath, and follow me into the night, where the walls remember everything, and where even the darkest prisons have something quiet, human, and unexpectedly peaceful to share.
Alcatraz, a name that once drifted across the cold waters of San Francisco Bay like a warning carried by the wind. A word so heavy that even the toughest men fell quiet when they heard it. Tonight, as you sink a little deeper into the comfort of your pillow, and let the world outside soften, we're going to step gently into that island of stone, not to fear it, but to understand the strange calm that lived inside its walls. Imagine waking in a cell so small you could stretch out your arms and almost touch both walls at once. A narrow space measuring just 1.5 by 2.7 meters. The morning light would slip in through the steel bars as a thin, colorless ribbon, barely enough to chase away the grayness. The air carried a faint mix of metal, dust, and sea salt. And if you listened closely, you could hear the Pacific breathing, a slow, ancient rhythm rising and falling beyond the stone. Even the most infamous prisoners, Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, couldn't escape that rhythm. They lived by it, slept by it, and sometimes surrendered to it. Because on the rock, the world beyond the waves felt like a dream fading out of reach. Every morning began exactly the same. A bell at 6:30, footsteps echoing along the corridor, the soft clink of keys, and a silence so complete it felt carved into the walls. Breakfast at 6:50, work at 7:30, lunch at 11:30, dinner at 17:30, lights out at 21:30. A loop repeating endlessly, day after day, week after week. And yet, inside that monotony, something curious often happened. The mind softened, the heart slowed. Even restless souls found themselves falling into a gentle rhythm, one that soothed them in ways they never expected. At night, prisoners sometimes lay awake, listening to the distant hum of San Francisco. Laughter drifting over the water, the clatter of a streetcar, the faint echoes of a city alive and free. It was close enough to imagine, but impossibly far. A separate universe. Some nights, the wind carried the sound of celebration across the bay. People dining, drinking, living. And in those moments, prisoners weren't plotting escape. They were remembering what freedom felt like, what warmth sounded like, what life had been before time slowed into stone. The waves never judged them. They never asked questions. They simply rose and fell, steady and patient, smoothing the edges of even the harshest days. And tonight, as you listen to the quiet around you, let those waves soften the edges of your day too. Let them wash over your thoughts, carrying away whatever you don't need to hold on to anymore. The walls of Alcatraz were thick, 30 centimeters of concrete layered over steel, and the waters around it were cold, often just 10 degrees Celsius, with currents strong enough to pull even the strongest swimmers backward. But despite all of that, the island wasn't just a place of despair. It was a place of strange, unexpected humanity. Inside those tiny cells, men dreamed tiny dreams. Quiet ones, fragile ones, small hopes that flickered like candlelight, even in the thickest fog. Some dreamed of home. Some dreamed of redemption. Some dreamed simply of touch, a handshake, a hug, the warmth of another human voice. And yet, in those dreams, there was something tender, proof that even the harshest walls couldn't completely erase the softness of the human spirit. As you listen now, as the night settles gently around you, imagine the waves brushing against the island's jagged edges. Imagine the sound of distant city lights. Imagine the quiet breathing of the prisoners who once lay awake listening to the same sounds. There, in the stillness of the rock, people learned something they never expected. That even in a place built for punishment, there could be moments of peace. Soft moments, human moments. And tonight, as you rest safely, free, warm, comfortable, you can feel the echo of those forgotten nights on Alcatraz. A quiet reminder that even in the harshest places, stillness can be found, and that sometimes the gentlest peace is born in the unlikeliest corners of history. If you could stand in the corridor of Alcatraz during the late afternoon, you'd notice something unexpected, something soft, hidden inside all that harsh stone. As the sun began to fall behind the hills of Marin County, the light that entered the prison shifted from gray to a muted gold, casting long, gentle shadows across the concrete floors. For a brief moment each day, the rock almost looked warm. The guards felt it, the prisoners felt it, and even though the rules allowed no conversation, no lingering, no personal expression, the quiet glow of that hour created a strange sense of shared humanity, a moment when no one was a criminal, no one was a guard, and no one was truly alone. That hour was often the most peaceful part of the day. Some inmates would stand near the bars and let the sunlight touch their faces, closing their eyes to imagine that somewhere, far beyond the sea, families were gathering for dinner, children were laughing, and life was unfolding without walls. Others simply listened. The evening wind carried different sounds compared to the morning, lower, deeper, more reflective. The waves became slower, dragging across the rocks like a tired breath. Seagulls circled overhead, their calls echoing off the concrete structures in a way that made them sound almost like faraway memories. It was during these quiet transitions between day and night that the mind wandered the most. Some prisoners replayed old mistakes, searching for answers they wished they had found earlier. Some imagined futures they knew they would never reach, and some stopped thinking altogether, letting the rhythm of the island wash their thoughts smooth and empty, like stones polished by the tide. Inside the cell house, life moved with deliberate slowness. You could hear distant footsteps, the soft rustle of uniforms, the creak of old hinges, sounds that blended into a pseudo pattern, almost hypnotic if you let yourself drift with them. In the library wing, the faint rustle of pages turning sometimes floated through the hallway. Books were one of the few freedoms Alcatraz offered. Men who once knew only chaos found comfort in stories, letting the words transport them far beyond the fog-covered bay. Some read adventure novels, imagining themselves crossing oceans or climbing mountains. Others read philosophy, hoping to understand why their minds changed when the world around them grew small. And there were those who chose books purely for the rhythm of the language, to soften their thoughts before the long night arrived. As dinner time passed and the sky deepened from gold to blue, the world inside the prison grew quieter still. Lights dimmed slightly, footsteps slowed, and even the seagulls disappeared into the fading horizon. Night on the rock did not fall suddenly. It gently settled, like a thick blanket being lowered over the island. In those moments before lights out, prisoners sometimes whispered to themselves, not full conversations, but soft murmurs, quiet reminders that they still existed. A name, a memory, a promise, a fragment of a song they once knew. These little murmurs were acts of survival, tiny sparks of identity preserved against the weight of isolation. And outside, the city lights began to shimmer, a glow so faint from Alcatraz that it seemed more like the memory of a city than the city itself. But prisoners watched it anyway. They leaned toward the tiny windows in their cells, not to escape, but simply to feel connected to something that kept moving when their world did not. For some, it was a heartbreak. For others, strangely, it was a comfort. Proof that life continued, that change still existed, that somewhere out there the world breathed in colors brighter than gray. Tonight, as you rest, imagine standing there for a moment, feeling the cool air on your face, hearing the distant hum of life across the bay, sensing the quiet pulse of the island beneath your feet. The night on Alcatraz was cold, yes, but it was also soothing in its stillness, and in that stillness, even men who had lost everything found a tiny moment of peace before sleep finally claimed them.
There were nights on Alcatraz when the fog crept in so slowly that the entire island seemed to dissolve into a soft, pale mist. From the cells, prisoners could sometimes watch the fog roll across the water like a living thing, quiet, patient, and strangely gentle. When it wrapped around the prison walls, sound changed, echoes softened, footsteps dulled. Even the waves seemed to hush themselves, as if the ocean, too, was falling asleep. On those nights, the men on the rock often felt the world shrinking until nothing existed except the cold air, the dim light, and their own breath. Some found that terrifying, others found it comforting, but all of them felt it. In the thick fog, time moved differently. Minutes stretched longer, like threads being pulled gently apart. The island's harsh edges faded, and Alcatraz stopped feeling like a fortress and became something quieter, an island suspended between sea and sky, between memory and oblivion. Prisoners sometimes described those nights as the moments when the island forgot how to be cruel, not because the walls softened, but because the world outside disappeared. There was no city, no lights, no reminder of freedom just across the bay. Only stillness, only breath, only the sound of fabric shifting as someone turned over in their cot. And in that strange softness, even the guards walked quieter, as though raising their voice might disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the prison. Inside the cells, men often clung to their evening rituals, small, delicate routines that helped them survive the weight of isolation. One man tapped his thumb gently against the underside of his pillow, matching the rhythm of the waves he couldn't see. Another whispered a single phrase to himself, a small mantra meant to keep his thoughts from unraveling. Some combed their fingers through their hair in slow, deliberate motions, grounding themselves. Others counted their breaths until numbers lost meaning and sleep washed over them like warm water. These rituals were invisible to everyone but the ritual maker, yet they were vital. They were pieces of the outside world smuggled into a place that tried so hard to erase anything human. But nothing could fully erase it, not even Alcatraz. When lights went out at 9:30, darkness claimed the cell house, but it wasn't a violent darkness. It was gentle, a darkness that moved like velvet being drawn over the island. And if you stood in the corridor at that moment, you'd hear something beautiful. Silence layered with tiny details, the soft shifting of blankets, a short exhale, a whisper of fabric, the faintest creak from a bed frame adjusting to the weight of a tired body. These sounds would blend together until they formed something like a lullaby not meant for comfort, but born from it anyway. Outside, the ocean continued its slow breathing. Waves rose,
curled and broke against the rocks in a rhythm older than any prison wall. Some nights that rhythm aligned perfectly with the sleeping breaths inside the cell house. A subtle symmetry between nature and confinement, between freedom and stillness, between two kinds of quiet. In those rare, delicate alignments, the men who slept inside cold cells experienced something they could never fully explain, a peace not found in freedom, but in surrender. Not surrender to the walls, but to the moment, to the night, to the sound of the ocean reminding them that life existed beyond metal and stone. And as sleep finally pulled them under, they drifted into dreams shaped by soft rhythms, distant memories of warm kitchens, slow conversations, the sound of someone humming while doing dishes, the creak of a familiar floorboard, the feeling of grass beneath bare feet. Dreams fragile enough to break, yet strong enough to carry them through another day. Tonight, as you rest, imagine that same quiet wrapping around you like the fog that once wrapped around the rock. Imagine the world softening until there is only your breath, only the slow rhythm of your heart, only the gentle weight of your body sinking deeper into rest. The men of Alcatraz survived countless nights by surrendering to this stillness, and now you too can let it guide you into sleep. Let the ocean breathe, let the fog settle, let the world narrow until only calm remains. Tonight you are safe, tonight you are free, and tonight the forgotten lullaby of Alcatraz will help carry you softly into dreams.
Now, imagine the air shifting as we cross the Atlantic Ocean, drifting from the quiet swell of the Pacific to the gentle murmur of the River Thames. The night deepens, and as the clouds part, the silhouette of the Tower of London rises, ancient, solemn, and older than almost any structure we visited tonight. Built in 1066 by William the Conqueror, the tower has stood for nearly 1,000 years, watching kingdoms rise and fall, monarchs come and go, and countless stories drift through its stone corridors like lingering ghosts. Tonight, you and I will walk softly into that world. Not the world of executions or political intrigue that history books so often highlight, but the silent, tender world that only existed after sunset. The Tower of London was not a torture chamber for most of its royal prisoners. Instead, it held a different kind of weight. The weight of waiting, of uncertainty, of listening to one's own heartbeat echo against stone walls thicker than memory. Imagine Anne Boleyn in her final days, standing at a narrow window, watching the Thames glide gently beneath the moonlight. The river moved slowly, as if trying not to disturb her thoughts. She would have heard the soft rustle of fabric as ladies in waiting moved quietly around her, and the distant murmur of ravens perched on the battlements, their calls sharp yet strangely comforting. These ravens still live there today, protected by legend, but in Anne's time, they were simply part of the soundscape of a long, uncertain night. Picture the Norman stone walls, cold, heavy, unchanging. The candlelight flickering against them created long, trembling shadows, bending with each small sway of the flame. The rooms that housed royal prisoners were furnished, even decorated with tapestries, but they were still cages, gilded in part, yet unmistakably confining.
The air inside carried the subtle scent of wax, wool, and river mist. Sometimes you could hear the echoing footsteps of a guard on the stairway, the metallic whisper of armor brushing against stone, or the soft toll of a faraway church bell drifting through a narrow window. These sounds were not frightening. They were anchors in the silence. They reminded prisoners that the world continued outside their confinement, even if they could not reach it. Royal prisoners passed their time in quiet rituals, reading small leather-bound books, writing careful letters by candlelight, or whispering prayers that rose like mist above the flickering flame. These rituals were not grand acts of resistance. They were small acts of preservation, ways to keep the mind from unraveling in the stillness. In the Beauchamp Tower, inscriptions carved by prisoners still remain. Names, mottos, shields, and quiet pleas etched into the walls by hands that trembled with fear, hope, or both. At night, these carvings would have glowed softly in the candlelight, each line catching a faint shimmer, each curve forming a silent testament to the loneliness endured within those walls. And then there was the Bloody Tower, a name heavy with centuries of rumor. But despite its reputation, night inside the tower was often gentle. The cold wind would slide across the ancient stones, and the ravens outside would settle their wings, their nighttime calls fading to soft murmurs. In that hush, prisoners often found a strange comfort. Not happiness, not freedom, just a fragile sense of peace born from the quiet acceptance of the moment. Tonight, as you listen to this story, imagine yourself standing in one of those narrow rooms, feeling the cool air drift through a slit window, hearing the low hum of the Thames beyond the walls. This night is not about fear. It's about stillness. It's about letting your thoughts settle onto ancient stone, the way countless souls once did as they waited, prayed, and drifted gently into sleep. Let the tower's quiet embrace surround you now. Let the calm seep into your breath. The night is long, but it is gentle. And in that gentleness, even the most uncertain hearts once found rest.
As night deepens over the Tower of London, the air cools and settles like a soft cloak around the ancient stones. The city beyond the fortress glows faintly with lanterns, flickering windows, and the muted hum of life that continues along the Thames. But inside these walls, where time moves slower and every breath feels suspended between history and silence, a different kind of night begins. The tower does not creak loudly or groan with age. Instead, it breathes softly. A faint draft drifts through the arrow slits, carrying the scent of damp moss and old mortar. The stone floors hold the memory of countless footsteps, guards, queens, traitors, philosophers, and those who came here not as criminals, but as symbols in a game of power larger than themselves. And tonight, we drift gently into that world, following the quiet rhythm of lives once paused here. Royal prisoners were not thrown into darkness.
Their rooms were lit with candles, adorned with tapestries, and furnished well enough to resemble chambers rather than cells. Yet despite the comfort, there was a strange heaviness, as if the very air understood the weight of uncertainty that lingered inside. In the hush of night, you can almost picture a nobleman seated at a wooden table, a quill in hand, writing a letter that may never be delivered. Perhaps he pauses, listening to the distant toll of a church bell drifting across the river, or the slow beat of his own heart echoing against the stone. Across the courtyard, in another chamber, a young princess might whisper a prayer. Her hands tremble, not from cold, but from the unknown. She presses her palms together and closes her eyes as candlelight flickers across her face. Outside her window, a lone raven shifts its wings and lets out a soft, croaking call, neither ominous nor comforting, simply part of the natural music of the tower's nights. If you listen closely, you might hear the faint flutter of parchment, the scratch of a quill, or the quiet sound of fabric brushing against stone as someone kneels beside a bed to pray. These sounds once shaped the nights of those who waited here, waited for pardon, for exile, for execution, or simply for dawn. And waiting in the tower was its own kind of prison. In the Beauchamp Tower, prisoners carved messages into the stone, each letter a small rebellion against oblivion. Some etched their family crests. Some wrote mottos of hope. Others only carved their names, trying to ensure that time, cruel as it was, would not swallow them fully. Imagine those carvings by candlelight, the shadows slipping into the grooves, the letters glowing faintly like embers of forgotten courage. Outside, the wind moves through the courtyard, brushing across the traitor's gate, the very gate where many who entered never walked out again. Yet even this place, feared by so many, becomes quiet at night. The water below laps gently against the stone, its sound soft and lulling, as if the river itself is whispering stories of centuries gone by. And above it all, the ravens move among the battlements, their silhouettes black against the moonlit sky. They hop softly along the stone edges, their claws making tiny clicks that echo faintly in the still air. Prisoners often heard those sounds and wondered whether they were omens or simply another part of the tower's eternal rhythm. But for us tonight, they're part of the same soft lullaby that has followed us from Alcatraz, the lullaby of stone, wind, and time. As the night settles fully, imagine the tower growing quieter still. Torches dim, the river slows its murmur, the walls absorb the lingering whispers of centuries. And in that stillness, we find what so many prisoners once reached for, a moment of calm inside uncertainty, a pause long enough to breathe, long enough to rest. Tonight, as you listen, allow yourself to step into that moment. Let your thoughts slow. Let your breath ease. Let the ancient quiet of the Tower of London guide you gently toward sleep, as it once guided restless hearts who waited in the night for whatever fate the dawn would bring.
There were nights at the Tower of London when the darkness seemed to arrive not from the sky, but from the stones themselves. Ancient stones that had absorbed centuries of footsteps, whispers, confessions, and final breaths. When the last torch dimmed and the courtyards emptied, a velvety stillness wrapped around the fortress like a shroud, quieting even the restless wings of the ravens along the battlements. In that stillness, time felt slower, softened, almost suspended. For the prisoners who spent their nights here, nobles, poets, heirs, advisors, sleep did not come easily. It drifted toward them like a cautious guest, approaching only after the mind had grown tired of circling the same thoughts over and over. Imagine lying on a simple bed covered in wool, the embroidered tapestries swaying slightly from the draught that seeped through a narrow window. Candlelight had long since burned down, leaving only the silver glow of the moon filtering through the iron lattice and casting patterns across the floor. The Thames flowed somewhere beyond the walls, its sound muted but steady, a rhythmic reminder that the world outside continued its gentle cycle of rise and fall. And inside the tower, a prisoner might close their eyes and try to match their breathing to the water's sound, slow, even, surrendered. Some nights, the distant sound of a church bell drifted across the river like a ribbon of memory, calling out the hours to a city that slept unaware of the quiet hearts trapped in this ancient keep. Bells marking time for those who had too much of it. Bells marking time for those fearing they had too little left. And between each chime, the silence grew deeper. The mind filled with images, a dining hall lit in gold, the echo of music from a forgotten dance, a loved one's voice, the softness of a familiar touch. In the tower, memories were both comfort and torment, warm enough to soothe, sharp enough to ache. And yet these memories were often the only companions prisoners had during the long stretch between dusk and dawn. Some found peace in repetition, tracing the grain of the wood beside their beds, counting breaths until the numbers blurred, or gently running their fingers along the carved inscriptions left by those who came before them. Those carvings, names, mottos, symbols, remained cool under moonlight, each groove holding a fragment of someone else's story. Perhaps a young noble traced the lines of a crest carved generations earlier, wondering about the person who made it, and whether they too had stared into the night, hoping for a peace that never arrived until exhaustion took over. Outside, the ravens shuffled along the battlements, feathers rustling softly. Legends said the kingdom would fall if the ravens ever left the tower, but at night they were simply shadows gliding across stone, creatures who had watched more history than any human. Their presence brought an odd comfort, a reminder that some things persisted through centuries of change. Even fear softened in their company.
The tower's cold corridors held echoes, but none sharp enough to disturb the quiet that settled over the fortress like a lullaby woven from shadow and moonlight. For royal prisoners, morning could bring judgment or mercy, but night brought something much gentler: a pause, a sigh, a stillness deep enough to rest in. And tonight, as you sink deeper beneath your blankets, you can drift into that same stillness. Imagine the moonlight, the stone beneath your hand, the whisper of wind through the tower's ancient walls. Let these images soften your thoughts the way they once softened the hearts of those waiting for fate behind the tower's gates. The night is no threat here. It is a shelter, a calm, ancient shelter carved from history and silence. Let it hold you. Let it lull you. Let it guide you softly into dreams, just as it once guided the restless sleepers of the Tower of London.
From the cold stones of Europe, we drift now into a world completely different, a world where the air itself feels alive, where the night hums with insects and distant waves, and where the line between paradise and suffering grows thin enough to blur. Devil's Island, Île du Diable, a name carried by hot winds across the tropical Atlantic, a place the French hoped the world would forget, and a place where thousands of exiles found themselves suspended between life, punishment, and the relentless breath of nature itself. Imagine stepping onto an island where the temperature lingers around 35 degrees Celsius even after sunset, where humidity hangs thick in the air like an invisible curtain. Every breath feels heavy, warm, and close. The jungle around you whispers, leaves brushing softly against each other, insects calling from the shadows, and the faint movement of animals you'll never see but always sense. This was Devil's Island, the heart of the French penal colony in South America. Opened in 1852 and operating for more than a century, it became one of the most notorious prison sites in history. Not because of iron bars or stone walls, but because nature itself became the guard, the enemy, and sometimes, strangely, the companion. Mosquitoes swarmed in thick clouds, bringing malaria and fever. The air carried the sharp, earthy scent of wet soil and rotting leaves. Paths turned to mud within minutes of rainfall. And if a prisoner dared to dream of escape, the sea answered with circling sharks, waiting patiently just beyond the shallows. But tonight, we are not here to feel fear. We're here to explore the quiet resilience that grew in the shadows of this island. Henri Charrière, Papillon, spent 13 years in this world. He described nights spent in sagging wooden huts, sleeping in hammocks that swayed gently with the wind. Sometimes the forest spoke through the thin walls, the rustle of branches, the chirp of nocturnal insects, the roar of waves pounding the distant cliffs. At other times, the silence was so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Imagine lying in a hammock, listening to the slow rhythm of the ocean. The wooden beams above you creak with age. Outside, the moon lights the treetops in silver, turning the jungle into a shifting landscape of shadows. The scent of damp wood
and rain-soaked leaves surrounds you like a blanket. It should be frightening, but oddly, it's not. Because on Devil's Island, night was one of the few times when the heat loosened its grip and the body could finally relax. The soft patter of tropical rain often began in the late afternoon, falling steadily, rhythmically, as if played by hands older than memory. That rain washed the dust from the leaves, cooled the ground, and carried away the heat of the day. For prisoners, it was one of the few sounds that offered comfort. They listened to it fall on palm leaves, on thatched roofs, on the packed dirt outside their huts. The rain didn't bring freedom, but it brought breathing space, something precious in a place where life was measured in survival rather than days. Alfred Dreyfus, wrongly convicted, spent 5 years on this island. His cell was a small stone building, isolated from others. Each night, he wrote letters to his wife, pouring his thoughts into words that might travel across oceans. He listened to rain beat softly on the roof, listened to the forest move, listened to the silence between each heartbeat. His world was small, but within that smallness, he found a kind of inner endurance, a strength born not from defiance, but from quiet persistence. And, as the years passed, tropical nights continued their rhythm. Soft rain, distant waves, the hum of unseen life. 80,000 prisoners were sent into this penal world. Only 30,000 returned. The numbers are stark, but each represents a life that wrestled with heat, illness, loneliness, and the relentless song of the jungle. Tonight, as you listen to these echoes of the past, imagine the warm rain falling outside. Imagine it washing over leaves, smoothing the sand, absorbing the heat. Let that sound wash gently over your thoughts, the way it once washed over Devil's Island, softening the edges of fear, cooling the weight of the day, and guiding countless souls toward a fragile, precious sleep.
Night on Devil's Island did not fall quickly. It drifted in, the same way the tide crept up the rocks, slowly, deliberately, as if tasting the edges of the jungle before settling into place. When the sun lowered itself into the horizon, the sky dimmed into a deep orange that clung to the treetops like burning embers. And then, almost reluctantly, the light slipped away, leaving behind a soft blue darkness filled with the gentle chorus of the forest. Unlike the cold silence of Alcatraz or the solemn stillness of the Tower of London, the nights here were alive. Every second vibrated with tiny sounds, the chirp of insects that sang endlessly, the rustle of palm leaves bending beneath the weight of night air, and the low rhythmic hiss of waves sweeping across the island's rocky shore. And despite the danger that surrounded them, many prisoners found comfort in these sounds, sounds that reminded them they were part of a world that breathed and swayed, even as they were confined to its loneliest corner. Imagine yourself standing near the edge of the jungle. The ground is soft under your feet, still warm from the day's relentless heat. A faint breeze moves through the trees, carrying the earthy scent of moss and damp soil. In the distance, lightning flickers behind a curtain of clouds. Not a storm yet, just a whisper of one.
On Devil's Island, storms came often and without warning. Sheets of rain would fall from the sky, drumming against the rooftops and flooding the paths. But before the rain, there was always this moment, the heavy pause when the world inhaled and held its breath. Prisoners knew that moment well. Some used it to prepare their sleeping hammocks. Others simply sat in the doorway of their huts, watching the jungle darken shade by shade, listening to the forest come alive. It wasn't peace in the traditional sense. It was something more primal, something older than language, an awareness that they were tiny beings in the heart of a vast, untamed world. Henry Charrière wrote about such nights with a strange tenderness. He described how the moon cast silver streaks on the waves, how the wind sometimes carried the scent of ripe fruit, how even in captivity, nature offered glimpses of beauty that softened the harshness of the penal colony. But he also wrote about the weight of loneliness. Nights on Devil's Island were long enough for memories to circle back, long enough for regrets to uncoil, long enough for the mind to wander toward home. A hammock creaking gently under the weight of a tired body, a letter folded and tucked beneath a pillow, a whispered thought that no one else would ever hear. Not all prisoners slept in wooden huts. Some, especially those punished or isolated, slept in stone cells with only a slit for air. The humidity trapped itself in those walls, clinging to skin, making the nights feel heavier. But even there, behind rock and rusted bars, the sounds of the island seeped in. The ocean's steady rhythm, the insects' lullaby, the soft patter of small animals moving through the underbrush. These sounds traveled everywhere, filling every space where silence tried to settle. And then the rain would come, first as a soft tapping, like fingertips brushing against leaves, then a steady fall, then a downpour so dense it blurred the entire jungle into a silver curtain. The noise was overwhelming in the beginning, a roar that swallowed every other sound. But as minutes passed, the rain softened into a rhythm, steady, predictable, soothing. Prisoners often lay awake listening to it, letting its cadence wash through their thoughts. Rain meant respite. Rain meant cooler air. Rain meant a brief return to comfort in a place that rarely gave any. Some prisoners even said rain made the island feel almost gentle. And perhaps that is the strangest truth of Devil's Island, that a place built to break spirits could also, in its own wild way, cradle them. Tonight, as you listen to this story, imagine the rain falling softly around you. Imagine the heat dissolving into mist. Imagine the forest humming with life as the island releases the weight of the day. Let the tropical night settle around you, warm and rhythmic, like a heartbeat older than memory.
There were nights on Devil's Island when the darkness felt almost tender, as if the jungle itself was trying to soothe the people trapped within its reach. Long after the rain eased and the forest shook off the last droplets clinging to its leaves, a softer stillness settled over the penal colony. It wasn't silence. Devil's Island never truly slept, but rather a gentler rhythm, a slowing of the island's heartbeat as the night deepened. In that softened darkness, the moon slid across the sky like a silent lantern,
casting pale silver light onto the worn paths prisoners walked during the day. The huts stood quiet, their roofs glistening faintly from the rain, while wisps of fog rose from the warm earth, drifting lazily between the trees. If you stood near the shoreline, you could feel the contrast of temperatures, the cool breath of the ocean meeting the warm exhale of the jungle. The waves brushed against the rocks in long, sleepy strokes, as if the sea was tired from the day's relentless sun. It was in moments like this that prisoners often found the courage to look outward rather than inward. At night, with the guards resting, with the jungle calmer than usual, the sky became the only unbroken freedom they could touch. Some lay in their hammocks, staring through gaps in the wooden walls. Others slipped quietly outside, careful not to draw attention, and looked up at constellations they hadn't seen clearly since their last night of freedom. The southern stars were different from those in Europe. Brighter, sharper, almost startling in their clarity. Many prisoners wrote later that the night sky was the one thing the penal colony couldn't corrupt. It was a reminder that the world was larger than their suffering, larger than the island, larger than the punishment carved into their days. Some whispered stories to themselves, memories of childhood, of winters far away, of streets where the air smelled of bread instead of salt and sweat. Others thought of people they loved, imagining how their names might echo if spoken into the tropical dark. And then there were those who simply let their minds drift into blankness, choosing rest over thought, choosing surrender over struggle. Not everyone found comfort. The night also amplified fears. The jungle's shadows sometimes moved in ways that made the imagination stir. Eyes reflected moonlight from the underbrush. Small animals, but in the dark they felt bigger. Sometimes the wind pushed through the trees hard enough to create low moans, making prisoners wonder what else might inhabit the island, beyond snakes, insects, and restless memories. Yet even fear had a strange softness here. Perhaps because the island itself was so overwhelming during the day that the night, no matter how haunting, felt gentler in comparison. Even the sharks circling the island, always waiting, always patient, seemed to vanish into the blackness of the sea, giving the illusion of peace. Rainwater, still pooled in shallow depressions, reflected the moon like broken mirrors. The jungle shimmered with dampness, and everywhere the scent of wet earth rose upward, grounding every breath. Alfred Dreyfus often described nights as both torment and refuge. The solitude pressed heavily on him, but he also found that the night gave him permission to soften, to think without urgency, to breathe without expecting anything from the next day. In those hours, he was not surrounded by accusations or guards. He was surrounded by the hum of crickets, the hush of the ocean, the faint swaying of palm fronds. And in that strange mixture of isolation and nature's embrace, he found something close to resilience. That was the paradox of Devil's Island. It broke bodies. It broke spirits. Yet some nights, wrapped in heat and moonlight, it gave prisoners a fragile, fleeting sense of being held rather than hunted, of resting rather than resisting. Tonight, as you drift into your own night. Imagine that gentle tropical hush around you. Imagine the air warm against your skin, the distant ocean steady, the forest whispering softly. Let the night of Devil's Island cradle your thoughts, smoothing the sharp edges of the day, guiding you slowly, quietly, toward sleep. From the humid forests of Devil's Island, we now drift back across the ocean, returning to the steady heartbeat of America, Philadelphia, 1829. A city buzzing with ambition, invention, and a belief that society itself could be reshaped. But tucked quietly behind its brick streets and horse-drawn carriages stood a place unlike any the world had seen. Eastern State Penitentiary. A prison built not with the intention to punish violently, but to punish gently, to correct through silence, through solitude, through the weight of one's own thoughts. Imagine stepping inside its gates for the first time in the early 19th century. Before you stretches a fortress of towering stone, cold and gray, crowned with battlements that mimic medieval castles. But it is what lies inside that makes this place unforgettable. 7 cell blocks spread outward from a single circular hub, like the spokes of a massive wheel. From the center, a single guard could observe every hallway at once, a design meant to watch without being seen, to discipline without raising a hand. This was the home of the Pennsylvania system, an experiment the world had never attempted. Each prisoner entirely alone. No talking, no seeing another face. Days measured not by conversations or footsteps, but by a thin ray of sunlight slipping through a single skylight above the cell, the eye of God. Now, imagine waking in that cell. The air is cool and still. The room around you is small but not cramped, long enough for a narrow bed, a wooden table, a low stool. The walls are rough with age, but clean. There is no window on the wall, only that opening above your head, letting in a soft, almost sacred glow that shifts silently as the day passes. That light becomes your clock, your companion, your reminder that time still moves even if your life seems frozen. For many prisoners, that silence was maddening. For others, it became unexpectedly soothing. Al Capone, notorious mobster, spent 9 months here in 1929, but his room didn't look like the others. A Persian rug softened the stone floor. A polished desk stood in the corner. A radio played soft music that drifted through the chamber like a ghost of normal life. There were paintings on the wall, landscapes, muted and warm. And yet Capone later wrote that the silence felt heavier here than any cell he had known. No footsteps, no whispers, no clinking chains, only the sound of his own breath, echoing faintly in the curved ceiling. In truth, Eastern State Penitentiary was never quiet, not entirely. The wind whistled through its long stone corridors, making the halls feel like lungs exhaling slowly. Wooden doors thudded shut in dull, distant notes. Sometimes a guard's steps echoed softly between the walls. But compared to the chaos of other prisons, this place felt like a cathedral carved from discipline and stone. Charles Dickens visited in 1842, expecting reform. What he found instead unsettled him. He wrote that the isolation was cruel and wrong, that a person left alone with their thoughts for years would suffer more deeply than any bodily pain. And yet, amid this silence, some inmates blossomed. They learned to read. They learned to carve wood, or knit, or shape leather. When your world is one room and one sliver of sky, even the smallest act becomes an anchor. Imagine a prisoner sitting beneath that beam of light, turning the pages of a worn book, tracing each word slowly. Imagine another practicing letters with a stub of pencil, the scratching sound the only thing breaking the quiet. And imagine someone lying on their narrow bed, hands folded over their chest, simply breathing. No rush, no noise, just breath and stone and light. Tonight, as we step deeper into this chapter, let the hush of Eastern states surround you. Let the stillness smooth the edges of your thoughts. Let the faint echo of footsteps in its deserted halls guide you gently toward rest. Night inside Eastern State Penitentiary did not arrive with drama. It drifted in the way dust settles on an unused bookshelf, softly, almost unnoticed, until you suddenly realize the world has gone dim. As the sun lowered itself behind the thick stone walls, the long hallways began to change. The warm light slowly thinned, turning to pale gold, then to a muted gray, and eventually dissolving into a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to breathe with the building itself. In that darkness, sound behaved differently. Footsteps echoed longer, as if unsure where to go. The faint clink of a guard's key felt louder, sharper, and the distant whistle of wind passing through high, narrow windows took on a haunting softness. For prisoners living in solitary confinement, this shift from day to night was one of the most emotionally powerful moments. With no voices, no human presence, no shared rituals of evening, night became something internal, something that unfolded inside the mind rather than outside the cell. Imagine lying on a thin mattress, hands folded on your stomach, staring up at the single skylight above. During the day, its beam of light moved slowly across the floor like a patient finger drawing invisible paths. But at night, the skylight became a dark circle, still there, still open to the sky, but now filled with shadows. Sometimes the moon passed overhead, brushing the cell with a soft, cold shimmer. Other times it was simply black, reminding prisoners how utterly alone they were in their small pocket of stone. And yet there was a strange comfort in that solitude. When the world outside your walls disappears, the smallest sensations become monumental. The coolness of the air on your cheek, the texture of the wool blanket beneath your fingertips, the quiet rhythm of your own breath. Some prisoners counted their breaths like a prayer. Others whispered to themselves just to prove that their voices still existed. Still others let their minds drift into memories of meadows, of dinner tables, of streets filled with noise and life.
Those memories were fragile but precious, like small candles in an enormous room. Outside the cells, the architecture of Eastern State contributed to its atmosphere. The radial design meant that even the silence had direction. Every hallway pointed inward, toward the central hub, a place where guards turned slowly in circles, observing every corridor that fanned outward like ribs of a stone skeleton. From the hub, a single lantern might cast its faint glow along multiple hallways at once, but dimly, weakly, as if the light itself feared waking the sleeping darkness. Prisoners rarely saw this vantage point, but they felt it. They knew someone, somewhere might be watching, not constantly, but unpredictably. That uncertainty created a discipline all its own, a pressure that did not raise its voice, but whispered just loud enough to change how you moved, how you breathed, how you thought. Charles Dickens wasn't wrong when he said the punishment here was psychological, but he also missed something: the quiet resilience that grew in many inmates, a resilience shaped not by defiance, but by adaptation. Picture a prisoner kneeling beside his small basin, dipping his hands into cool water, letting it run slowly over his wrists. Picture another sitting at the wooden table, carefully stitching a piece of leather, each pull of the thread creating a soft, repetitive sound that soothed him more effectively than any lullaby. Picture someone else reading a book by moonlight, their lips moving silently, savoring each word as if tasting drops of water after a long drought. Solitude did not affect everyone the same way. For some, it was crushing. For others, it was a strange mirror, reflecting back pieces of themselves they had forgotten. But for all of them, night brought a softness that the day did not. The hallways calmed, the guards relaxed, the wind slowed, and the silence, dense during the day, stretched itself thin and gentle, like a blanket laid carefully across the penitentiary. Tonight, as we wander through these quiet corridors together, imagine that silence surrounding you, not as emptiness, but as space. Space to breathe, space to release, space to rest. Let the hush of Eastern State settle softly in your mind, the way it once settled over thousands of solitary rooms, guiding tired souls into a deeper, calmer night.
There were nights at Eastern State Penitentiary when the silence felt almost alive, as though it walked gently through the cell blocks, touching each door with invisible fingers. Long after the last guard completed his rounds, long after the lanterns in the central hub dimmed to faint orange glows, the prison settled into a kind of stillness that was not empty, but full of memory, of breath, of everything left unsaid by the thousands who once lived inside its stone ribs. In that stillness, the penitentiary seemed to breathe with the prisoners. When the wind slipped through the tall slots near the ceiling, it created soft murmurs that traveled the length of the hallways. The sound was neither comforting nor frightening, just old, ancient even, like the voice of a place that had watched human lives unfold and unravel for more than a century. Imagine a prisoner sitting on the edge of his narrow bed. His hands rest quietly on his knees,
His eyes trace the faint patterns of light cast by the moon as it passes over the skylight. Outside, the world continues. Horses pulling carts along Market Street, families eating dinner, someone playing a violin in a boarding house. But inside this cell, the night feels suspended, a pocket of time detached from everything else. Some prisoners use these hours to pray. Not loudly, not with desperation, but softly, almost meditatively. Their whispers folded into the quiet, blending seamlessly with the creaks of wooden doors and the distant sigh of the building settling for the night. Others lay back and stared into darkness, letting their minds wander down paths they no longer dared to walk during the day, paths lined with regret, hope, fear, or memories of a life that felt impossibly distant. Within the solitude of Eastern State, night created a strange equality. A king and a beggar, a scholar and a thief, a man guilty and a man innocent. Each one lay down in his own small space, each one staring up at the same round opening of sky, each one listening to the same faint wind that drifted across the penitentiary's stone corridors. Even Al Capone, with all his influence and comforts, felt it. On quiet nights, he reportedly believed he heard the voice of the man he once killed, whispers that grew louder the longer he stared at the shadows on the wall. Whether real or imagined, Eastern State had a way of amplifying the things buried deep inside the human mind. But not all nights were haunted. Some were surprisingly gentle. Picture the soft glow of moonlight spilling into a cell, illuminating the curved ceiling like a pale halo. Picture a prisoner slowly turning the pages of a book, the paper whispering beneath his fingers. Picture another lying with hands behind his head, simply enjoying the rare sense of calm that arrived when the world was quiet enough to let his heartbeat sound like a small, steady drum. And sometimes the penitentiary felt almost protective. Its thick walls, designed to isolate, also shielded from winter winds, from summer heat, from the chaos of the outside world. And in that sheltering stillness, men who had once feared the silence began to lean into it. They found patterns in their days, routines, quiet rituals that grounded their thoughts, polishing a metal cup, folding a blanket perfectly, tracing cracks in the wall that resembled rivers on an old map. In those routines, something softened, something settled. The prison didn't become home, but it became predictable, and predictability brought an unexpected sense of peace. As the penitentiary aged and the decades passed, the silence became its most enduring resident. When the prison finally closed in 1971, the echoes stayed behind. Visitors today walk the same long corridors, and many swear they can still feel the weight of that quiet, can still sense the invisible presence of thousands of nights spent in solitude. Tonight, as you rest, imagine that same quiet settling around you. Imagine the slow, gentle breath of an old building releasing its tension. Imagine the softness of moonlight sliding silently across stone. Let the hush of Eastern State cradle your thoughts, easing them one by one into stillness. Let it remind you that silence, when embraced, becomes not an absence, but a refuge, a place to lay down the heaviness of the day, a place to begin drifting toward sleep.
So imagine the soft roll of a Mediterranean tide as it slides past the hull of a small wooden boat, the kind that would have carried prisoners across the narrow stretch of water from Marseille to a lonely island crowned by a stone fortress. Tonight, we drift toward that same island, not as prisoners, but as quiet observers moving gently through time. Château d'If
rises out of the sea like a pale ghost, its limestone walls washed smooth by centuries of wind and salt. Under the moonlight, the fortress looks less like a prison and more like a memory, one carved by storms, sculpted by history, and softened by the endless lullaby of waves. In 1524, King Francis I ordered this fortress to be built as a guardian of Marseille, but as the decades passed, its purpose shifted. By 1580, the cannons were still in place, but their thunder had fallen silent. It was no longer a fortress of war. It had become a fortress of solitude, a place where unwanted voices were sent to fade into the murmurs of the sea. Imagine stepping onto the island. The salty wind brushes your skin, carrying a faint tang of seaweed. Seagulls cry somewhere overhead, but even their calls sound dulled, as though respectful of the silence the island demands. The fortress walls loom before you, 3 stories of cold stone pierced by narrow windows that watch the sea like tired eyes. Inside, the rooms are arranged in layers of privilege and despair. The upper cells, reserved for noble or wealthy prisoners, are touched by sunlight. Their windows open toward the shimmering blue horizon, where light dances on the water like scattered coins. Prisoners in these cells could feel the wind, hear ships leaving Marseille, and sense the world continuing without them. Their imprisonment was a gilded cage, yet still a cage. The middle floor housed ordinary prisoners, sailors, smugglers, political dissenters, men whose names history did not bother to remember. Their rooms were darker, the air heavier, the silence thicker. And beneath everything, beneath the fortress and the sunlight and the wind, lay the lowest level. Here, in the cold belly of the island, the dungeons waited. These were not rooms so much as stone cavities, damp with the breath of the sea and shadowed so deeply that daytime never reached them. The average prisoner who descended into this underworld survived only months. The humidity soaked every bone. Diseases moved like silent ghosts from one man to another. Some prisoners whispered prayers. Others dreamed of sunshine they would never feel again. These were the voices that gave Château d'If its haunted reputation. Voices swallowed by darkness, woven into the stones, carried eternally by the tides. And then, of course, there is the most famous prisoner of all, not a real man, but a fictional one, whose story made the fortress immortal. Edmond Dantes. Wrongfully accused, forgotten by the world, left alone in a cell where time itself seemed to move in circles. For 14 years in Alexander Dumas' tale, he fought despair, carved tunnels through stone, met the wise Abbé Faria, and dreamed of hope buried on a distant island. Even though he never existed, his suffering felt real enough that visitors today still search for his cell, as if by standing where he might have stood, they can feel the faint heartbeat of the story that has echoed through centuries. The truth, however, is far simpler. No prisoner ever escaped. The water surrounding the island was icy, the currents violent, and the sea creatures indifferent to human dreams. And yet, when you stand on the ramparts today, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the waves, it becomes clear why Dumas chose this place. The island feels trapped between reality and myth, between history and imagination, between confinement and the endless freedom of the sea, stretching infinitely beyond. Tonight, the fortress is peaceful. The moon paints gentle silver paths across its stones. The air smells of salt and quiet. And as the waves brush the rocks with a softness that seems almost affectionate, you realize that even the harshest prisons have their moments of calm, moments when the world holds still, when the past feels close enough to touch, and when the sea sings softly enough to lull even the heaviest thoughts toward rest.
If you walk slowly through the corridors of Château at night, you can almost feel the building remembering. Each step echoes softly, not sharply, as though the stones themselves are cushioning the sound, shaping it into something gentle, something resigned. The air is cool and carries a faint scent of salt and old iron, a blend that has drifted through these hallways for centuries. In some corners, the sea breeze slips through tiny openings in the wall and brushes your skin like a whisper from a forgotten past. It's hard not to imagine the prisoners who once paced these same floors, their footsteps soft and hesitant, their thoughts heavier than their chains. Above you, wooden beams creak quietly with the shifting temperature of the night. Outside, the waves continue their endless rhythm, brushing the rock foundations with a softness that contradicts the island's harsh history. Inside the fortress, lanterns once cast trembling light on stone archways. Shadows rose and fell with each gust of wind, often startling prisoners who had begun to hear meaning in every tiny sound. Because here, isolation was not simply a condition, it was a companion. Some prisoners found themselves staring for hours at the patch of sea visible from a narrow slit in the wall. The water shimmered in silver ripples beneath the moon, a moving mirror they could never touch. Waves rose and collapsed, came close and retreated, like freedom itself drifting near, but never offering its hand. Others listened to the muffled hum of Marseille from across the water. The city's sounds traveled strangely over the sea, distorted by distance. The laughter from a tavern, the call of a merchant, the clatter of distant wagon wheels. To a prisoner trapped in Château, those sounds must have felt like memories, warm but unreachable, familiar but fading more with each passing night. And in the darkest cells below, time moved differently. The air there was thick, humid, and heavy. Prisoners sometimes marked the days by tracing lines in the dirt or carving notches into the wall. But eventually, even these markings became meaningless as nights bled into mornings and mornings merged back into nights. The sea was the only constant. From the deepest cells, the roar of waves was more than a sound, it was a presence. When storms hit the island, the waves battered the rocks with a ferocity that shook the entire fortress, making the prisoners feel as if the sea itself
wanted to swallow the island whole. Yet on peaceful nights, the same water quieted into a tender rhythm that soothed even the most restless minds. It wasn't just prisoners the fortress held. Animals, messengers of foreign lands, occasionally passed through its gates. The most famous was the rhinoceros given to Louis XV, who stayed here briefly before being transferred to Versailles. Imagine that scene, a massive creature far from its homeland, standing in a Mediterranean fortress, its heavy breaths echoing through the courtyard. Even the walls must have felt confused by such an unexpected guest. The island, despite its small size, held layers of stories, some historical, some imagined, and some whispered by the sea itself. Fishermen passing by often claimed that on certain nights they could hear voices riding on the wind. Perhaps it was only the echo of waves against the cliffs or the distant cry of seabirds, but to those who believed in such things, Château carried the weight of the souls who never left. And even now, when the fortress is no longer a prison, when visitors wander its halls with cameras and curiosity, that atmosphere remains. The silence isn't empty, it is full. With memory, with longing, with thousands of nights that blended into one long twilight. And tonight, as you drift deeper into this story, the sea begins to soften its rhythm, as though recognizing the presence of a quiet listener. The moon hangs low over the horizon, painting the waves with pale silver, and the old fortress, standing steady on its lonely island, feels less like a place of punishment and more like a guardian of forgotten stories, stories that invite you to rest, to breathe, and to let the hush of the Mediterranean guide you gently toward sleep.
As the night deepens over the Mediterranean, Château d'If becomes a place suspended between sea and sky, as though the island itself is drifting through a dream. The moonlight traces the ridges of the fortress walls, softening every harsh edge, and the waves below transform into a steady, calming breath. At this hour, it is easy to imagine the island not as a prison, but as a silent sanctuary where stories settle like dust on ancient stone. Imagine standing on the highest rampart, where the wind brushes against your face with the gentlest touch. The sea stretches endlessly, silver and quiet, and the city of Marseille glows faintly in the distance, a cluster of lights trembling like fireflies. For the prisoners who once stood here under guard, this view must have been both a comfort and a torment. Beauty so close, freedom so impossibly far. Some of them, especially those kept in the upper rooms, may have spent long evenings tracing the line of the horizon with their eyes, losing themselves in the play of moonlight on water. They would have heard ships leaving the harbor, the faint murmur of sailors calling to one another, and the rhythmic clank of chains lifting anchors. Those sounds carried a promise they were never meant to receive, the promise of movement, of escape,
of lives continuing without them. Further down, inside the fortress, where the air grew still and the hallways narrowed, prisoners sought different kinds of solace. They created rituals out of necessity, small, repetitive motions that brought rhythm to their days. One man might polish a metal spoon until it shone like a scrap of moonlight. Another might trace patterns in the dust on the floor, forming shapes only he understood. Someone else might whisper stories into the darkness, passing time by weaving memories into threads of comfort. And in those whisperings, the island changed shape. For some, it became a monastery of patience. For others, a cavern of loneliness. For a rare few, it was the beginning of transformation. Because even the harshest isolation can become an unexpected mirror, reflecting not what a man has lost, but what remains within him when everything else is stripped away. The sea, indifferent yet constant, played its own role in these transformations. When storms rose, the fortress shuddered under the assault of giant waves, and prisoners felt the island tremble beneath them, as if the earth itself were uncertain of its place. But during calm nights like this one, the water became a companion, soft, repetitive, and strangely reassuring. Many prisoners, especially those who slept closest to the outer walls, described how the sound of waves lulled them into a trance-like state. That rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, seemed to carry them far beyond their cramped rooms, floating them gently across memories, regrets, and small hopes they had tucked away for years. On rare occasions, the island saw moments that broke through its sorrowful history. A guard bringing news from the mainland, a letter arriving after months of silence, a prisoner allowed a few minutes of sunlight in the courtyard. These fragments of brightness, though fleeting, carved deep impressions in the minds of those who received them. Like glimmers reflected on dark water, they reminded the prisoners that the world was still vast, still alive, and still held places where their names might one day be spoken again. And eventually, time itself softened the fortress. By the early 20th century, Château d'If was no longer feared but remembered. No longer a place of confinement, but a relic of stories carried across generations. When the prison finally closed and transformed into a historic site, the atmosphere shifted yet again. Visitors walked through rooms once filled with despair, but instead of fear, they found a quiet reverence. They paused beside old stone walls, listening for echoes they knew they wouldn't hear, but somehow felt. They looked out the same narrow windows and watched the sea glitter, just as the prisoners once had. And for a moment they understood. Not the suffering, not the punishment, but the profound stillness, the kind that humbles you, quiets you, and draws your breath into a slower rhythm. Tonight, as the waves wash softly against the rocks of Château d'If, that stillness lingers. It wraps around the fortress like a pale veil and settles gently on everything it touches. And in that hush, your thoughts begin to loosen, your shoulders soften, the knot of your day slowly unwinds. Let the Mediterranean breathe for you now. Let the old fortress watch over you steady and silent, and let the stories of this island born from shadows and seawater, carry you into a deeper, calmer rest. If you close your eyes tonight and listen carefully, you may hear the distant breath of the Atlantic, cool, steady, unfaltering. That same breath once rolled endlessly across the waters surrounding a small island 12 kilometers from Cape Town, an island where men were sent not only to be punished, but to be forgotten. Robben Island, a place whose stones have held centuries of footsteps, from exiles of the 17th century to one of the most extraordinary men of the 20th, Nelson Mandela. The name of the island comes from the Dutch word for seal, and in the early mornings, the cries of seabirds mixed with the splash of waves as seals lounged on the rocks. But to those imprisoned there, the island's natural beauty was not a comfort. It was a reminder of a world they could see, but not touch. The boat ride to the island was short, but for Mandela, who arrived on June 13, 1964, it marked the beginning of a long separation from everything he loved. He was 46 years old when he stepped onto the island's rough ground. 18 years would pass before he left it again. Imagine the room he entered, B5, a space so small it could not hold more than what the authorities allowed. A mat on the floor, a thin blanket, a small table, a bucket for water, and another for sanitation. A barred window, barely the width of a hand, let in a slice of cold light. The walls were bare, pale, and hard, but they watched everything quietly, the routines, the fatigue, the silent resistance. Days on Robben Island began early. At 5:30 in the morning, prisoners were shaken awake by the chill of the Atlantic winds that slipped through cracks and crevices. Breakfast was a modest bowl of maize porridge. Then came hours of labor in the limestone quarry, where the sun glared down so fiercely that even the chalky dust seemed to burn. The white limestone reflected the sunlight with a brightness almost blinding, but the prisoners were not given protective eyewear. Many lost part of their vision, eyes reddened, watering, stinging. Still, they worked, breaking rocks under the hot African sun. And yet, what happened in the quarry was not simply labor. It became one of the most remarkable classrooms in history. During rare, brief breaks, Mandela and his fellow prisoners exchanged ideas about politics, economics, philosophy, and justice. They called it the University of Robben Island because each man became a teacher to another. Knowledge was passed quietly, discreetly, but powerfully. Men entered the prison angry or defeated, but many of them found a purpose, a direction, a clarity they had never known before. Meanwhile, at night, when the winds softened
and the sea became a gentle whisper. Mandela sat on the floor of his small room, using what little light he had to write. Portions of his memoir, Long Walk to Freedom, were written here, scribbled on scraps of paper, hidden inside empty cocoa cans, smuggled past guards who searched carefully, but not carefully enough. The rhythm of the sea outside became a companion, a grounding force that kept despair from overpowering determination. Letters were precious treasures. Prisoners were allowed to send and receive only one letter every 6 months. Each letter could not exceed 500 words, and every sentence was carefully censored. Mandela's wife, Winnie, carried the weight of their separation, raising their daughters alone, her own life shaped by surveillance, restriction, and strength beyond measure. Through all of this, Mandela wrote, "I never lost hope. Even in the darkest days, I could see a glimmer of light." And it was true. The island, which seemed designed to break men, instead witnessed resilience growing like wildflowers in the cracks of stone. Tonight, as you listen to the ocean's hush, you are hearing the same sound Mandela heard through that tiny window, a reminder that even in captivity, the world continues, the sea breathes, and hope can remain unbroken.
At night, when the sky over Robben Island darkened into a deep velvet blue, the prison grounds transformed into a world of shadows and whispers. The harshness of the day, its blinding quarry dust, its relentless sun, its commands barked by guards, faded into something almost gentle. The Atlantic waves slowed their rhythm, smoothing themselves against the rocky shoreline as though trying to comfort the men held inside the small cells facing the wind. Mandela often described these nights not as empty or lonely, but as moments suspended between exhaustion and reflection. With only a thin blanket to soften the concrete floor, he would sit quietly, his back against the cool wall, and let the silence settle around him. In that silence, he could hear everything more clearly: the sigh of the sea, the distant call of seabirds, the shuffle of another prisoner turning in his sleep, the faint rustle of wind pushing through the cracks of door frames. The world outside continued moving, but here time stretched and thinned, becoming calm enough for thoughts to unfold gently. One of the strictest rules on Robben Island was the separation of prisoners based on their security classification. Mandela and the other political prisoners were isolated from the general population because the authorities feared the spread of ideas more than the spread of violence. But isolation did not silence them. The men found ways to communicate, through whispered exchanges in the courtyard, through coded messages hidden in laundry, through brief moments of eye contact that carried encouragement across yards of cement. Even the smallest gestures held meaning. A nod, a half smile, a piece of bread slipped quietly from one meal tray to another. Compassion became a language spoken without sound. And yet, despite all attempts to create connection, the days remained grueling. The quarry work stripped skin and spirit. The guards used humiliation as a tool, hoping it would break the unity of the group. But the opposite happened. Hardship became the glue that bound the prisoners to one another. They shared stories during breaks, stories of families waiting at home, stories of childhood memories untouched by politics, stories of dreams that no prison could erase. These small exchanges formed an invisible network of strength across the camp. Books, when allowed, were devoured. The prisoners studied Shakespeare, law, economics, and poetry with intensity, even though they had no podium, no audience, no classroom except the bare earth beneath their feet. Robben Island was harsh, but it unknowingly sculpted a generation of thinkers. When Mandela wrote letters, limited to 500 words, inspected line by line, he chose his words with precision. Every sentence became a bridge between the island and the world beyond it. Sometimes the letters carried disappointment, sometimes determination, often tenderness. And every 6 months, when he received a visit from Winnie or other family members, the moment was both painful and healing. They were separated by a glass wall. They were watched by guards. They only had 30 minutes. But for those 30 minutes, the outside world felt real again. Mandela later wrote that these visits were like a sip of water to a man dying of thirst. Yet what sustained him even more deeply was the belief that the struggle was larger than himself. Beyond the fences, beyond the harsh routines, beyond the blinding quarry, there existed a vision he held on to, a vision of a South Africa where equality was not a crime and freedom was not granted to only one part of the population. And so each night, as darkness settled gently over the island, he allowed himself to rest, not simply because his body needed it, but because rest itself was an act of preparation. Rest made resilience possible. Rest made hope durable. The sea, faithful in its repetition, lulled the prison into a kind of soft breathing. And Mandela, listening to it, learned to let his thoughts drift, not in despair, but in quiet strength. Tonight, that same rhythm washes against the island, and if you listen closely, you might feel a similar softness rising in your own breath, a calm that reminds you of the power inside you, even when the world feels heavy.
There were nights on Robben Island when the darkness settled so gently over the land that even the harsh walls seemed to breathe with a softer rhythm. Those nights carried a strange, quiet clarity,
A sense that the world beyond the fences, the guards, and the cold cement floors still existed, still waited, still moved forward. For Mandela and his fellow prisoners, this feeling often arrived in the late hours, when the wind calmed and the island felt wrapped in a deep contemplative silence. In that stillness, Mandela would lie on his thin mat, his hands folded over his chest, gazing at the small patch of sky visible through the narrow window. Sometimes the moon hung there, framed perfectly between iron bars. Other times, clouds drifted slowly across the opening, like soft gray ships. And on rare, cloudless nights, the stars appeared, sharp, bright, and impossibly far away. Those stars, Mandela later wrote, reminded him of the immensity of the world. They reminded him that even though he was confined to a cell barely larger than his outstretched arms, the universe remained vast, open, and filled with possibility. Hope, he realized, was not something that guards could lock away. It was something he carried inside him. During these quiet nights, Mandela often replayed the memories of his early life. His childhood in Kunu, the pastoral rhythm of village life, the warmth of his mother's voice, the guidance of the elders who taught him the values that would later define his leadership. These memories did not make him long for the past. Instead, they strengthened him, rooting him in a sense of identity untouched by imprisonment. Other nights he thought about the future, not as a fantasy, but as a responsibility. In the depths of isolation, he shaped the vision of a South Africa built on equality, dignity, and shared humanity. He imagined a nation where no child would grow up fearing the color of their own skin, where reconciliation could heal even the deepest wounds left by injustice. These dreams, held close in the dark, became a quiet fire that warmed him during the coldest seasons on the island. But Mandela was not alone in his reflections. Many prisoners experienced similar moments of clarity. The harsh conditions stripped away everything superficial, leaving only the core of who they were, their values, their beliefs, their resolve. The political prisoners often said that Robben Island revealed a man to himself. Some discovered strength they never knew they had. Others confronted fears they had long ignored. In a strange, paradoxical way, the island became a place of growth. Outside the cells, the routines continued. Yelled instructions, the clatter of metal bowls, the heavy slam of gates. But beneath all that noise, a quiet current flowed between the prisoners, weaving them together with threads of solidarity. They shared books smuggled through the system, taught each other languages, debated deeply, laughed when they could, and held on to the belief that dignity could survive even in a place designed to crush it. And the sea, always the sea, played its steady lullaby. Some nights it roared with the fury of storms, crashing against the rocks like a warning. But on the nights when the winds softened, the water whispered instead, a long, slow breath that carried across the island, soft enough to soothe men who had known too much hardship. As Mandela listened, he often imagined that the ocean was carrying messages from the world beyond, not in words, but in rhythm, in reminders that life continued even when he could not see it, that somewhere across the water his children were growing, that people were fighting, marching, and speaking his name, that change, although slow, was coming. When Mandela was finally moved from Robben Island in 1982, he left behind a cell that witnessed the transformation of a man, from prisoner to symbol, from symbol to leader. But the island did not release him empty. It sent him back into the world with sharpened clarity, with unbroken purpose, and with a sense of peace rooted in resilience. Years later, after the fall of apartheid, Mandela returned to Robben Island, not as a prisoner, but as a free man walking through the gates with steady steps. He visited his cell again, touched the walls, looked through the same narrow window, and he smiled, a quiet smile, the smile of someone who knows that even the darkest nights can shape the brightest dawns. Tonight, as the waves around Robben Island continue their steady rhythm, may that same soft strength settle over you, calming your thoughts, easing your breath, and guiding you toward a gentle, restful sleep.
There is a certain softness to Paris when night falls, a gentleness that wraps itself around the rooftops and riverbanks, settling over the city like a velvet curtain. And tonight, as we drift together into the quiet heart of the 18th century, that softness makes the shadows even more meaningful. Because the place we are about to visit, the Bastille, was never meant to be touched by gentleness. It stood at the eastern edge of Paris like a stone giant, 8 towers rising 24 meters into the sky, each one built to intimidate, to watch, to control. Yet even this giant had its moments of stillness, moments when the echoes faded, when the torches dimmed, and when the prisoners inside could almost forget the weight of the world pressing against its walls. Imagine Paris in those days, narrow streets lit by lanterns swaying softly, the Seine glimmering like a sheet of dark silk, and far in the distance, the silhouette of the Bastille standing against the night sky. For most people, it was only a fortress, something seen from afar, something whispered about over wine, something feared but never truly known. But for a few unfortunate souls, its cold corridors, its massive wooden doors, and its thick Norman stone walls became a world with no horizon. The Bastille was not a prison of chaos, it was a prison of silence, not the comforting silence of a peaceful night, but the heavy silence of uncertainty, the kind of silence where a man waits and waits and waits, not knowing how long he will remain, not knowing who decided his fate, not even knowing the crime he is accused of. Because inside the Bastille, you entered not with a sentence, but with a royal command, the infamous lettre de cachet. A single sealed letter from the king could erase your freedom for months, years, or a lifetime. Voltaire knew this silence. The brilliant mind who challenged the powerful with his words found himself locked away behind these walls not once, but twice. His first imprisonment lasted 11 long months, a punishment for a poem too sharp, too bold, too unafraid. And yet even Voltaire, with all his wit, described the Bastille as a place where time seemed to dissolve, where thoughts echoed louder than footsteps, where the mind became both companion and adversary. In the dim glow of candlelight, he wrote letters, drafted ideas, and imagined the world beyond the towers. Some nights, he heard the muffled sound of carriages outside the gates, hints of a life that continued without him, hints that freedom still existed, just out of reach. For other prisoners, especially nobles and intellectuals, the Bastille offered unexpected comforts. A fireplace to keep warm in winter, a writing desk, books, even the possibility of having meals brought from Parisian restaurants,
a strange luxury inside a place designed for punishment. But comforts do not erase captivity. Even with a soft bed and warm food, a man could feel the walls closing in, reminding him that he lived at the mercy of a monarch who might, at any moment, forget he existed at all. And there were others, those whose names never appeared in ledgers, who lived in the lower depths of the fortress where light seldom reached. Damp chambers, straw bedding, rats searching for crumbs. For them, the silence was not merely psychological, it was a physical presence, pressing against their ribs, sinking into their bones. Above them, Paris slept. Below them, time stretched endlessly. The Bastille, for all its stone and strength, was not simply a building. It was a symbol, a quiet but constant reminder of power concentrated in a single hand. And on nights when the wind moved around the towers in long, low sighs, it almost sounded as if the fortress itself was weary of holding so many secrets. Tonight, as we step gently into this world, into the flickering candlelight, into the pages of history that whisper instead of shout, let the story unfold slowly, easing your mind into the same calm that the prisoners longed for. And let the soft Parisian night guide your breath into an easy rhythm, like the heartbeat of a city on the edge of change.
If you listen closely now, beneath the soft hum of night, you may almost hear the faint echo of footsteps moving across the cobblestones outside the Bastille, the slow, deliberate rhythm of guards carrying lanterns through the courtyard, checking the heavy gates, making sure the iron chains remained locked until morning. These were not the hurried footsteps of fear, nor the whispers of rebellion. They were simply part of the nightly ritual, a rhythm that had existed for centuries, a quiet choreography that gave the fortress its heartbeat. Inside, the prisoners lived according to their own muted rhythms. Some, like the nobles, spent their evenings reading by candlelight, letting the glow warm their pale faces. Their rooms were small, but not unbearable. Fireplaces crackled softly in winter, books stacked neatly beside narrow beds, desks covered with ink and parchment. In these upper chambers, solitude became a strange companion, too quiet to distract, too gentle to torment, enough to make a man reflect on the life he once had and the life he feared might never return. But for others, the experience was far harsher. Deep in the lower levels, the oubliettes, the forgotten places, light rarely entered. Prisoners there had no views of Paris, no printed pages to keep them company, no warm meals carried from the outside world. Their world was darkness, damp stone, and the distant sounds of the city, sounds that floated down through cracks in the ceiling like fragments of a world they could no longer touch. And even in those depths, the Bastille seemed to breathe. When rain fell over Paris, droplets crept down the walls, each one leaving a soft, cold trace, as if the fortress itself were shivering. In winter, icy drafts slid under doors, carrying the scent of the river. In summer, heat pressed itself against the stone, making the air thick and heavy. Time in the Bastille was not measured by clocks, but by sensations,
by the faint shift of sunlight on the wall, by the change in the air's temperature, by the arrival of meals brought in heavy metal trays. Even for the privileged prisoners, routine was the only certainty. 3 meals, short visits from priests, letters censored or withheld entirely, days that blended into weeks, weeks into months, months into something like a dreamless existence. And yet, within these cycles of stillness, minds remained active. Some prisoners wrote poetry, some sketched, some kept journals in tiny hidden notebooks. Some, like the Marquis de Sade, scribbled pages upon pages of thoughts, sometimes philosophical, sometimes unsettling, on long strips of paper that he kept rolled inside the walls. These small acts of creation were lifelines, reminders that the world inside a man could remain free, even if his body was not. Then there were the sounds, the subtle orchestra of Bastille nights, the flutter of pigeons landing on battlements, the distant toll of Parisian church bells marking the hours, the creaking of wooden beams as the temperature shifted, the soft drip of water collecting in corners, the quiet murmur of a guard clearing his throat far down the corridor. To the prisoners, these sounds were not threats, they were companions, consistent, gentle, predictable, a kind of lullaby offered by the fortress itself. And above all, there was Paris, the living, breathing city just outside the walls. When the wind blew from the right direction, prisoners could hear laughter from taverns, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, or even faint music drifting from parties in noble homes. Those sounds carried both comfort and sorrow. Comfort because they reminded prisoners that the world continued. Sorrow because the world continued without them. But the Bastille, for all its silence and heaviness, was not a place of total despair. Somewhere within its walls, hope lingered, flickering like candlelight in a drafty corridor. A prisoner might receive a letter after months of waiting. A guard might offer a small kindness. A rumor might spread of a release or a pardon or simply a change in routine. Even the stone walls seemed to hold their breath in those moments, listening. And tonight, as we linger in that fragile space between captivity and possibility, the Bastille becomes not just a symbol of oppression, but a reminder that even in the darkest places, the human spirit continues to reach for light, for meaning, for a future unknown but desperately hoped for.
As dawn approached in Paris, the Bastille often looked almost peaceful from the outside. When first light touched its rough stone walls, it softened the sharp edges, filling the air with a pale glow that made the fortress seem less like a place of fear and more like a silent guardian of the awakening city. Birds often perched at the tops of its towers, completely unaware of the stories unfolding behind those walls. And for a brief moment each morning, the Bastille felt suspended between two worlds. The world of the free, stirring to life outside, and the world of the confined, still trapped in their narrow rooms within. Inside, prisoners would slowly awaken to the faint sounds of Paris. Vendors calling from distant streets, hooves clattering across bridges, the ripple of the Seine,
as boats glided along its surface. But those sounds arrived muted, filtered through layers of stone that transformed them into faint, dreamlike echoes. To someone imprisoned long enough, these soft sounds could feel like memories rather than realities, like fragments of a life fading at the edges. It was in this fragile space between waking and waiting that many prisoners experienced their deepest reflections. Some wondered whether Paris had changed in their absence, whether friends still remembered them, whether their homes still stood, whether the lives they once knew had continued without missing a beat. The uncertainty was, in many ways, a punishment more subtle and more enduring than any physical torment. For some prisoners, hope came in unexpected forms. A guard who paused to speak a few human words, a letter delivered after months of silence, a book allowed through the gates. Even the sight of sunlight moving across the floor could become a source of comfort, a reminder that time still flowed, that the world still turned, and that the future, though unseen, still existed. And there were moments when the fortress itself felt strangely alive. The walls, thick as they were, carried vibrations from outside. A passing carriage, a sudden shout, a distant cheer from a festival in the city. These faint tremors were reminders that beyond the stone cage, Paris was a city constantly in motion, constantly dreaming, constantly rebuilding itself. It was this beating heart of Paris that eventually transformed the Bastille from a prison into a spark. On July 14th, 1789, an ordinary morning turned into a day of thunder. Crowds gathered outside the fortress, not prisoners this time, but citizens who demanded not just weapons, but dignity. Not just gunpowder, but the right to shape their own lives. They marched, not because they believed unlocking the Bastille would free vast numbers of victims. They marched because the Bastille had become the embodiment of something much larger, the feeling that a single building could hold an entire nation in silence. When the crowds finally pushed through, only 7 prisoners emerged. But the number didn't matter. What mattered was the symbol, the shattering of an era, the reclaiming of a voice, the collective breath of a nation waking from a long sleep. After that day, the Bastille lived on, not through its stones, but through its absence. Piece by piece, it was dismantled, its stones sold, carried away, transformed into new structures or kept as relics. Where towers once rose, a square emerged, open, bright, filled with movement. Place de la Bastille became a symbol of renewal, of a city rewriting itself, of the simple but profound truth that no wall, no matter how thick, lasts forever. And so tonight, as our story drifts gently toward stillness, the Bastille becomes something unexpected. A reminder that even the heaviest structures can crumble, that even centuries of silence can give way to a single human voice, and that Even in the darkest hours, change can arrive like a soft dawn, touching ancient stone. Let that thought settle into you now, gentle, unforced. Let it move through you, the way the morning light once moved across the Bastille's walls. Let it soften whatever weighs on your mind. For in the quiet moments before sleep, even the heaviest burdens grow lighter. And as Paris once did, you too can release what no longer belongs. Breathe into what is becoming, and rest in the calm of a night that asks nothing of you, except to let go.
As we drift into the final chapter of our journey, imagine for a moment that all the prisons we have visited tonight, Alcatraz, Eastern State, the Tower of London, Devil's Island, Robben Island, Bastille, are no longer places on a map, but quiet echoes surrounding you like distant chambers floating in time. Each one hums with its own frequency. Alcatraz still carries the cold certainty of isolation, the belief that removing a person from the world would somehow remove their danger. Eastern State still whispers the philosophy of silence, that a man could be reformed not by force, but by hearing only his own thoughts. Devil's Island leaves behind the smell of salt, jungle, and abandonment, reminding us how empires tried to exile their problems to the ends of the earth. Robben Island vibrates with the quiet, steady heartbeat of resistance, the place where Nelson Mandela turned a tiny concrete cell into a lighthouse for an entire nation. And Bastille. The Bastille hums with the memory of chains that finally snapped, with the truth that even stone can fall when the people rise. As these echoes drift around you, let them settle gently like dust on an old manuscript, because beneath the stories, beneath the centuries, lies one truth. Prisons are mirrors. They reflect not only the crimes of individuals, but the fears, hopes, and values of the societies that built them. Some of those reflections are uncomfortable. When we think of Alfred Dreyfus pacing in an exile hut on Devil's Island, punished for a crime he never committed, we are forced to confront how easily justice can be bent, how swiftly it can fracture when fear outweighs truth. When we imagine the nameless prisoners of the Tower of London waiting for news that never came, or the forgotten men in Bastille's lower vaults lost in darkness and mold, we feel the weight of all the voices history did not preserve. And yet, these places do not only reflect injustice, they reveal resilience, quiet, stubborn, miraculous resilience. Anne Boleyn walked her final steps with a calm few could fathom. Mandela turned forced labor into education, using sunlight bouncing off limestone to strengthen, not break, the minds of his companions. Papillon, real or partly mythologized, carried hope through storms, chains, and endless punishment, refusing to let the world extinguish his sense of possibility. Even in the darkest cells, human beings built rituals that held their spirits together. Some wrote letters they knew would be censored. Some scratched dates into stone, not to count how long they had been trapped, but to prove they still existed. Some learned languages, prayed, told stories, or simply breathed slowly through the night, reminding themselves that their minds were still their own. And now, as you listen, think of how each cell, whether on an island, in a fortress, or beneath a crumbling tower, held someone who once longed for what you have right now. Safety, warmth, freedom, a bed that is yours. It's a simple truth, almost fragile in its softness. Freedom is easiest to forget when you have it every day.
yet its absence becomes unbearable the moment it is taken away. Tonight, let the stories you've heard guide you gently toward a different way of seeing the world, not with fear, but with depth. Let them remind you that justice is never automatic, that fairness must be protected, that empathy must be chosen again and again. And let them remind you that the human spirit is astonishingly hard to extinguish, even in cold cells, even in silence, even in exile. As you breathe slowly, letting your chest rise and fall, imagine those echoes of chains falling, of pages turning, of waves washing against forgotten islands, fading into a soft hush. Tonight you are safe, you are free, and the world outside your window is open in every direction.
As our reflections deepen, imagine all the footsteps that once echoed through these prisons, blending into a single, soft rhythm. A rhythm that has traveled across centuries, crossing oceans, slipping through the cracks of stone walls, and finding its way to you. There is something almost paradoxical about these places, built to contain, yet they reveal so much. Walls meant to silence often ended up amplifying the truths societies tried to avoid. Alcatraz showed a nation grappling with fear, order, and desperation. Eastern State exposed the fragile line between solitude and suffering. Devil's Island captured the cruelty of exile, how distance can wound deeper than chains. Robben Island witnessed the transformation of a prisoner into a president. And Bastille embodied the moment a people realized that their fear was smaller than their demand for freedom. Think about how each prison, in its own strange way, has left behind more than memories. They've left warnings, reminders of what happens when power is not questioned, reminders of how justice can collapse under pressure, reminders that cruelty often hides behind bureaucracy and official stamps and lists of rules. But in equal measure, these prisons also left behind proof of something tender, the stubborn endurance of hope. Even in the darkest corners of these structures, human beings created small rituals to keep their minds alive. A folded piece of paper hidden under a mattress, a song whispered into the cracks of a wall, a memory repeated each night so it wouldn't fade, a sunrise glimpsed through iron bars that reminded someone the world was still turning. It's remarkable, isn't it, that even in the coldest, harshest environments, people found a way to imagine a future. That in places built to crush the spirit learned to bend instead of break. Many of the prisoners we've talked about tonight are remembered not because they lived comfortable lives, but because they endured the opposite. Their stories survived because they kept their humanity when everything around them tried to strip it away. Perhaps that is why the world continues to revisit these prisons, not just as historical sites, but as places of learning. When visitors stand inside Mandela's cell, they often fall silent, not because of the small size, but because of the vastness of what was created inside it. Strength, vision, calm persistence. When people walk through the echoing hallways of Eastern State, they sense how overwhelming the absence of sound can be.
when they stand on the windy cliffs of Alcatraz, staring at the glittering city across the water, they feel the ache of how close freedom can be, even when utterly unreachable. And when they pass through the symbolic footprint of the Bastille in modern Paris, they realize how fragile institutions can be, how quickly stone can fall, how easily a single day can change the direction of a nation. These places remind us that justice must evolve, that fairness is not a finished chapter, but a continual rewriting. Every generation must protect it, question it, and improve it, because the moment society stops paying attention, the cracks begin to form. Tonight, as you lie peacefully, think about how fortunate it is to live in a world where you can choose where to go, when to speak, how to live. None of those freedoms are small. None of them are guaranteed. They exist because countless individuals, famous and forgotten, free and imprisoned, pushed against the weight of injustice until the world shifted. Let that thought settle into your breath. Let it soften your shoulders, slow your heartbeat, and quiet your mind. You do not need to hold the whole world to might. You do not need to solve anything. You only need to rest, knowing that the struggles of others have shaped a gentler path for you. Let that gratitude wrap around you like a blanket, and let history keep watch at the door while you sleep.
As our journey approaches its quiet end, imagine all the stories we've walked through tonight slowly settling like dust across an ancient library floor. Each prison we visited becomes a chapter gently closing itself, not with a thud, but with the soft sigh of a candle going out. Alcatraz retreats back into its cold fog. The Tower of London folds itself once again into the centuries of monarchs and whispers. Devil's Island sinks back beneath its humid shadows and restless insects. Eastern State lowers its heavy curtain of silence. Château lets the Mediterranean wind slip through its ruined stones. Robben Island stands firm beneath the South African sun, carrying the weight of memory with grace. And Bastille, long gone, lingers only as an echo of defiance, a reminder that even the mightiest walls eventually crumble. Now, in this final stretch, let your breath deepen as though you've stepped out of those dark hallways and into the open air. Let the night feel spacious again. It is remarkable how much these places can teach us without ever speaking. They tell us without words that justice is fragile, that freedom is precious, that power needs boundaries. But they also teach something quieter, something far more personal, that the human spirit is quietly, stubbornly luminous. Think of Mandela reading by the dimmest light, writing thoughts that would someday shape a nation. Think of Anne Boleyn facing her fate with steady eyes, refusing to let fear define her final hours. Think of Dreyfus holding on to dignity while the world outside debated his innocence. Think of Voltaire turning imprisonment into resolve, sharpening the ideas that would change minds across Europe. These stories remind us that adversity does not always destroy. Sometimes it refines, Sometimes it reveals. Sometimes it becomes the unexpected forge where the strongest parts of us are shaped. And yet, these stories also remind us of something else, that none of these people chose their confinement. Their struggles were burdens placed upon them, not paths they willingly walked. You, however, lie here freely. Your room is quiet because you choose peace, not because silence is enforced. Your door is closed because you want rest, not because it is locked. These differences matter. They are the quiet proofs of a life lived in freedom, a freedom so ordinary that you may forget its weight. As you rest tonight, hold on to a gentle sense of gratitude, not the loud, overwhelming kind, but the soft kind that makes your breath feel warmer, your mattress feel softer, your heartbeat feel slower. Gratitude for the ability to open a window. Gratitude for the choice to turn a light on or off. Gratitude for the people you love who live just beyond the walls of your home, not far across an ocean or behind a guard's uniform. Gratitude even for time itself, time that belongs to you, that no one can take or measure or ration. Let these thoughts drift around you like a warm tide. No rush, no pressure, just a slow, steady reminder that the night belongs to you and you belong to the night in the gentlest possible way. And if your mind wanders, as minds often do, to your own challenges or your own uncertainties, let the stories you've heard tonight guide you toward a softer perspective. If people survived loneliness in stone chambers, you can survive the anxieties that sit lightly on your shoulders. If they found purpose in confinement, you can find clarity in quiet moments. If they discovered strength when stripped of everything familiar, you can uncover courage in the simple act of resting, breathing, being. The world outside your window may hold chaos, noise, unfinished tasks, and unpredictable storms, but none of that needs to follow you into this moment. You are allowed to let go. You are allowed to surrender to rest. You are allowed to drift where the night leads you. Tonight, history has walked beside you not to haunt you, but to comfort you, to show you that the human story is larger than any hardship and that peace can be found even in the most unlikely corners. Now imagine the final darkness gently dimming like a lamp being slowly covered by a soft cloth. Imagine the last echoes of those ancient prisons dissolving into silence. And imagine yourself floating into sleep with the knowledge that you are safe, free, and held by the quiet wisdom of those who came before you. Good night. May your dreams be light, warm, and unbroken.